Richard Casanova could feel pleased with himself. At the age of just 30, the junior member of the Brise de Mer gang had become one of its key players. This unrivaled strategist would soon reveal the full extent of his talent. The affair that was to propel the Bastia clan to the summit of the organized crime took place in Geneva on Sunday, March 25, 1990.
Les Suisses n'en sont pas encore revenus. Un hold-up record a été commis hier dans une succursale de l'Union des banques suisses à Genève.
4 malfaiteurs armés raflent 200 kilos de billets de banque en devises étrangères, somme totale aux alentours quand même de 150 millions de francs.
The UBS heist was one of the heists of the century, one of the biggest heists in organized crime.
Their biggest armed raid. That was the UBS job. The jackpot, really huge.
Ce soir, pas la moindre trace à l'horizon. Les gangsters se sont envolés avec leur trésor.
You had all the elements of an action film, like Ocean's 11.
Le plus étonnant dans cette affaire, c'est qu'il n'y a pas eu d'effraction ni déclenchement du signal d'alarme.
There was no need to break in, no need for any violence, so it was the perfect bank job.
It was nicely set up, perfectly organized, quick and efficient.
And that's when we saw that Richard Casanova was one of the brains because he organized, prepared, and coordinated it.
In Switzerland, as in France, the halcyon days of break-ins were over. No more robbers like the Postiche gang. At the beginning of the 1990s, new security systems were casting bank robbers into despair. But the Brise de Mer gang still had one mountain to climb: the fortresses that were the major banks.
When all is said and done, Geneva is the money capital, the banking capital, with the richest banks. It was bound to become a target for the bank robber gangs.
It was an exceptional heist in that it took place in what was, for the Swiss at any rate, the inner sanctum.
It was one of the biggest banks in Geneva, supposedly impregnable.
When you know the details of how it happened, it was like a knife through butter. It was that easy, full of holes like Swiss cheese.
The police officer at the heart of this affair was called Marco Matilla. At the age of just 35, he'd been promoted to the rank of chief inspector. He was the rising star of the Geneva police force.
On Sunday, 25th March 1990, I was in the office with my colleagues. I received a call, a bank robbery alert, saying a major robbery had taken place in the nerve center of UBS. So, off we went.
Marco Matti went to the headquarters of UBS in the heart of the old town. The entrance to the bank's offices is in the Sharping Arcade, Le Passage de Lyon.
When I went in, I saw the witnesses were tied up. They were receiving medical treatment because one of them had been injured. And then, in a storeroom a bit further on, we found a security guard who was seriously injured. So we called an ambulance to treat the individuals who'd been taken hostage. Then we went into the foreign currency department, where we saw a load of money on the floor. We were walking over banknotes. We were almost kicking over piles of billions of lira and all different currencies. And on the other side, there were the safes, which had been completely empty. It was a jaw-dropping moment, and we knew that there must have been a very, very, very large haul.
The stolen money needed to be carefully counted, patiently accounting for all the missing currency. And after a few days, they came up with a figure.
The total value was the equivalent of 32 million in Swiss francs.
32 million Swiss francs is the equivalent of 45 million euros in today's money. A jackpot that's very heavy indeed.
That's 220 kilos of paper, just 220 kilos of used banknotes. They were creased, used notes, but there were 220 kilos of them, an enormous sum of money.
According to the police's initial findings, the alarms had been neutralized. No doors or safes had been forced or broken. One overriding conclusion immediately came to mind.
We realized straight away that information had come from the inside, and they would have needed the codes, which could only come from someone working there. There must be a guard who was in on it. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
The police started their investigation focusing on the guards. They suspected at least 2 of them, but the interviews, surveillance, and telephone taps didn't turn anything up. So they widened their investigation.
Not long after, the director, Mr. Arnold, who was in charge of the whole department, mentioned his secretary and her husband to us. The husband was Michel Ferrari. And he told us that he was good friends with one of the guards, and also with someone who worked in the foreign currency department in accounts, and who had access to the codes. This triangle was a fairly solid base to start from.
Michel Ferrari was a strange fellow. He was a sports coach and a tennis teacher in his spare time. He seemed a bit agitated, which caught the attention of the police officers.
We tapped Michel Ferrari's phone, and that's how we found out that he was very angry because he'd organized the heist, given everything to the Corsicans, and the people who carried out the robbery hadn't paid him.
2 months after the UBS robbery, Michel Ferrari was arrested in Geneva. At first, he didn't realize what was happening to him.
They said to me, Mr. Ferrari, you're under arrest. I said, okay. They started to ask questions, and they said, we know everything. There's this, there's that. I said I was utterly flabbergasted when they told me that. I said, how did they know all that?
To trace the link between Michel Ferrari and the elusive Corsicans, Commissioner Maty started by looking into what the police call the background. He began by delving into the activities Michel Ferrari was prepared to admit to.
We found out pretty quickly that Ferrari often went to the south of France to transport silver bullions, which were then deposited in the foreign currency department at UBS.
For some years, the tennis coach had acted as a mule, carrying suitcases full of banknotes, jewelry, and bullion between France and Switzerland for wealthy clients wanting to avoid the French tax authorities. It was illegal, but the Swiss authorities turned a blind eye.
The Swiss would take anything. Their doors were wide open. We were importing money. It didn't matter where from.
This activity brought Michel Ferrari into contact with employees at UBS headquarters and with people working in the foreign currency department in particular. Currency from all the countries in the world passed through these offices. Huge sums of money, locked up in a dozen safes. One of the accountants in the department was Michel Ferrari's regular partner in fiercely contested squash matches. And in between backhands and forehands, this employee bared his soul.
I'd ask him how it was going at the bank. He'd say, you don't even realize there's money arriving all the time. I count it. And the safes? He told me that everybody knew the numbers to the safes. The codes on the safes hadn't been changed in 8 years. That's when I thought, hold on, maybe there's an opportunity here. And I talked to him about it. He said he'd see how we could get the numbers to the safes. I said, if we have those, maybe there's an opportunity for us to do something.
The idea of a bank robbery at UBS was starting to take shape in Michel Ferrari's mind. But at this stage, it was little more than a crazy fantasy. The bag carrier never dreamed of becoming a bank robber.
Ferrari was just a guy who said, look, there's a way I can get maybe hold of some money. Even if it's illegal, I'm going to do it. But he wasn't a gangster. That wasn't his mentality. Far from it.
It was then that, as fate would have it, Michel Ferrari met three men, three Corsicans passing through Geneva and wanting to deposit a large sum of money.
They were well dressed, suited and booted like businessmen. I stayed with them for a week. We talked, we ate together, and all that.
The Corsicans didn't reveal their true identities, but the three men were actually Joël and Jacques Patacchini and André Benedetti. Three men with extensive criminal records who belonged to the inner circle of the Brise de Mer gang. Their names were linked to several crimes, bank robberies, security van robberies, alongside the hardcore Brise de Mer members. At this stage, Michel Ferrari knew nothing about the Bastia clan.
I knew that these guys from Corsica weren't on the straight and narrow, and I started to ask them questions. I said to them, are you capable of carrying out a bank robbery, a heist? And that's when they said, yes, we do a lot of that. Even though I didn't know exactly what they'd done before, I thought to myself, this is great. I'm really pleased that I found these people. Exactly the right men for the job.
That was the first meeting. But at that point, he was just whetting their appetite, and they parted ways. The Corsicans said they'd be in touch in January.
It often happens like that. Most of the jobs that Le Brise de Mer did were passed on to them by someone. You need a contact with access to the bank. You have to be in the right place at the right time. And that's what happened here.
Over the course of several months, Jacques Patacchini met with Michel Ferrari multiple times to check the reliability of his information.
The Corsicans didn't take any unnecessary risks. They took time to assess Ferrari and his accomplices to see if the thing had legs.
At that time, I didn't have all the information about the codes and the safes and all that. We needed to find the big safe with the keys and the codes, but we hadn't got it. By chance, the colleague who worked at the bank found the code under a cardboard box, along with the keys. He said to me, okay, I've got the code and everything, and I can do it. And I said, okay.
But the codes weren't enough on their own. They needed to be able to get into the bank's offices and gain access to the foreign currency department. Michel Ferrari and his accomplice managed to persuade one of the security guards to carry out the job with them. At that point, all the lights were on green.
These accomplices provided the robbers with all the information they needed to carry out the heist with ease.
Michel Ferrari thinks there's just a single Corsican team led by Jacques Patacchini. What he didn't know was that in Bastia, the job was being discussed at the very heart of the Brise de Mer gang, and the board members had a game plan. The first thing was to cover their tracks. It was important that the people who'd found the job wouldn't be the ones to carry it out. The organization of the heist was entrusted to the most skilled member of the gang.
It was their chief commando. It was Casanova.
Richard was the leader. He checked out everything down to the smallest detail. He was a total perfectionist, but he had to stay in the shadows. He couldn't risk being out in the open.
To keep his identity hidden, Richard Casanova sent another member of the hardcore of the Brise de Mer gang to meet Michel Ferrari in Geneva. Alexandre Chevrier, who had a reputation for calmness and discretion.
Jacques Patacchini came along with a guy called Chevrier. He explained that he was a mate of his and he'd be carrying out the robbery because there was one person to do the preparation and another person to actually do the job. So Ferrari had these two guys and he took them to the site.
I didn't trust these people. I said, for our own safety, You have to get photos of them. I asked my brother-in-law to take the photos. He was upstairs in a restaurant. No one could see him.
That's the famous photo that's in the file. All three together on Place de la Fusterie.
The photos taken by Michel Ferrari's brother-in-law show Jacques Patachini in the middle and Alexandre Chevrier on his left. Ferrari thought of these photos as a kind of guarantee.
I had them taken, so I had proof that they'd come to Geneva. And then if it all went wrong, I had photos I could use against them if they grassed me up.
They didn't do much to disguise themselves. They wore glasses, they were well-dressed. They didn't stay with him long. They went to the Passage de Lyon to see where the entrance was, and then Patachini said, "We'll sort out the rest. We'll see you soon."
In actual fact, Michel Ferrari wouldn't see Jacques Patachini again because he'd passed the baton on to the second team. Richard Casanova raised one issue. How solid were the accomplices within the bank? To find that out, he'd have to get his hands dirty.
Casanova was a good judge of character. He'd listen to people and see what they were made of. That was his forte, and that's why he went to meet them.
Casanova came up with a slightly crazy idea to put the Swiss to the test. Getting into the foreign currency department prior to the heist. In other words, carrying out reconnaissance on site and checking the codes.
That meant going inside the bank without carrying out a robbery.
This audacious reconnaissance mission was to take place one evening after the offices closed.
I'd organized it so that the bank employees, who were in our pay, would let them in.
On the day of the reconnaissance, Alexandre Chevrier introduced two other people to Michel Ferrari. They were all disguised with beards and the like, and Casanova was one of them, unrecognizable.
There was a new guy with them. I said, "What's this? Are they bringing the whole family with them?"
Casanova, yes, he was there with two others. They went into the room with the safes, and they had access to everything, everything. They could have taken 2 bags there and then, no problem. But why leave with maybe 2 million when there was loads more to take?
Everything had been disconnected. Everything removed. The alarms went on. It lasted for more than an hour. They looked around, and they saw it was possible. They said, "It's so easy to get inside this bank." I said, "Yes, I told you so."
It was March 17th, 1990, and after the reconnaissance mission, they had to decide on a date for the heist. The following day, new information came to light that made them decide quickly.
Ferrari and the robbers had arranged for Ferrari to give them a signal when a large sum of money was arriving in the department. On that Friday, there was a huge sum arriving from the Bank of Morocco.
The arrival of this money would double the amount in the UBS safes. Casanova decided that the heist had to take place the following Sunday, and he summoned his Swiss accomplices to discuss the final details.
Michel Ferrari and his 2 accomplices met up at the apartment he'd rented at the request of Jacques Patachini. Not far from the UBS, he met there with Chevrier and Richard Casanova.
I met Richard Casanova the day before the robbery. A young guy, really handsome and everything. About 30, serious, a bit conceited.
Casanova ultimately decided to show his real face to put pressure on the 3 Swiss accomplices. So dropping out at the last moment was out of the question.
It was really tense because he was kind of threatening everyone. Then he said that if we didn't go through with it, we'd regret it, that he hadn't come here for nothing. They were veiled threats.
The robbers learned that day how the alarms on the safes worked, and also the combinations for opening them.
Finally, Ferrari gave Casanova a key, the key to a discreet house just outside the city center, where the robbers would deposit a share of the haul for the Swiss accomplices. They promised them half, around 22 million euros.
At that point, I really thought they'd do it. Because with all that money, there was enough for everyone. On the morning of the heist, Sunday morning, I woke up. I'd hardly slept a wink that night. Questions were running through my mind. What's going to happen today? It's a big day, whether good or bad.
While Michel Ferrari was on tenterhooks, at 7:40 a.m., a car and a van parked close to UBS. At 7:45, the guard at the front door, one of Ferrari's accomplices, opened up for the robbers.
They went in, and they tied up and gagged our accomplice. And then they locked up the others in the service area.
At 8 a.m., the robbers entered the foreign currency department. The guards heard the safes being opened, one after another.
They had to be precise. The codes were complicated. They had to turn them one way, and then the other, and then back again.
They were clearly very well-informed, methodical people. They left no clues. They did their job well.
The bank robbers even took time to choose between the different foreign currencies.
The department had Central African Republican francs and loads of lesser currencies that wouldn't be worth much and would be difficult to exchange. So they really focused on getting the strong currencies. They sorted through them. They had time, an hour and a half.
At 9:20, 2 vehicles drove into the shopping arcade and parked in front of the entrance. The bank robbers loaded dozens of sacks containing 220 kilos of banknotes, and they left. Three kilometers away, Michel Ferrari didn't yet know that the job he dreamt of for months had been a success.
I waited all morning until I saw the Swiss TV news. They announced that there'd been a massive bank job at UBS, but that no one had been hurt.
9h38 ce matin, passage des Lions, un passant découvre un homme bâillonné dans la loge de service de l'Union de banques suisses, là où se trouvent les tableaux de commande de la banque. Le passant alerte la police, elle délivre 4 hommes séquestrés dans la loge.
Well, I was really happy.
On réussit à ouvrir une dizaine de coffres de monnaies étrangères, 200 kilos de billets dévalisés.
Michel Ferrari was over the moon. He had itchy feet. He wanted to go and fetch his share and that of his accomplices. The Corsicans should have already left it in the house, which he'd given Casanova the key to.
I hardly dared to go because the cops were there. I could get picked up. I went in the evening to see.
Time went by, he waited, and a few hours later, no one had come.
And I realized this was looking bad for the future.
Michel Ferrari was in shock and took a few days to face up to reality.
They didn't give us our share because they wanted to, if you excuse my language, fuck us over. That's the long and short of it. They thought, they're only little Swiss guys, we'll have 15 million more to share between us.
Michel Ferrari was taken in by these gangsters because I think they thought he was just a patsy and he wouldn't take revenge. We can agree on that.
A patsy in this scenario is someone who's never really part of the gang. In other words, a useful idiot.
A patsy is someone that gets used and then tossed away like a Kleenex afterwards. So yes, someone who's been used and then, quote-unquote, chucked away like a dirty handkerchief.
It would later be said of Michel Ferrari, somewhat nastily, that he was the patsy of the century on this heist. In Bastia, the Brise de Mer gang were celebrating their success with their nearest and dearest, and in full view.
They were telling people in Bastia that they had so many safes to open that they didn't know which way to turn.
And everyone was applauding the heist on the Swiss bank. Everyone was saying, they're so brilliant.
From his prison cell, Francis Mariani was also savoring his gang's victory, and that of his friend Richard Casanova. But what they didn't know was that in Geneva, Michel Ferrari had decided to hit back.
He wanted to get his money. He wanted to bounce back with as much information as he could on the people who'd committed the robbery.
I thought I'd get the money back with the photos. I hadn't told them that I'd taken photos.
Michel Ferrari wanted to track down the Corsicans and get a threatening message to them. Pay up quickly, or he'll send the photos to the police.
He wanted to get back at the Patachini brother, to track them down. In any case, he'd already sent his brother-in-law and a friend down there to take photos.
Michel Ferrari managed to find out the names of his first contacts on the job: the Patachini brothers and Andre Benedetti. His brother-in-law's mission was to track down these people who had surnames that are very common in Corsica.
There were loads of Patachinis and Benedettis and so on, and they had to find the right ones. But they got there in the end and found Benedetti right on his doorstep.
He took a huge risk sending his brother-in-law to Corsica. Can you imagine? To take photos of Benedetti's house.
They took a photo. When I saw it, I knew it was him. That's when I started phoning. I told them, "You've got to pay me, otherwise I'll take the photos to the police. You'll be in trouble," and so on.
Ferrari had no idea that these people are ready to execute their own cousin or their own brother if they have to settle a score.
In spite of Michel Ferrari's persistence and his threats, he faced a wall of silence from the Corsicans.
I think the Corsicans despised him. He was of zero importance to them. Why would they even bother to get rid of him? He couldn't do anything.
Only one thing came out of this flurry of activity from Michel Ferrari. Commissioner Mati, who had him under surveillance for several weeks, now had proof that he was involved in the UBS heist.
When he arrested me, that Mati guy said, "Congratulations, it was a great job, but you had rotten accomplices."
Ferrari turned informer and named the Corsicans who'd betrayed him. An arrest warrant went out for Richard Casanova and his likely accomplices from the Brise de Mer gang. Marco Mati now set to work on the Corsican investigation.
We went down to Corsica, which is a really beautiful place that I absolutely love. But for doing surveillance, it was really quite tricky. We'd go to villages, and there'd be a granddad and two grannies sitting in a square giving you a sideways glance. A youngster who'd say, "What the fuck is he doing here?" So you turned around and left because there was nowhere to take up a surveillance position. It was practically impossible.
Commissioner Mati sussed out the place pretty quickly and realized that he would need to be very discreet.
One morning at 6 a.m., we decided to carry out a surveillance operation. We positioned ourselves in some scrubland close to where the Patachini family lived. There were a lot of us, maybe about 25, hiding in the bushes. And one of the guys said, "Look, there's a man coming out of Patachini's house." It was an old guy with gray hair. He got into a practically brand new white Mercedes, and he came up the road. And when he was level with us, he got out of the car. "Hey, police, police, I know you're there. The Patachinis told me to make these people some coffee. We're off, so make coffee for them." So we got up and spoke to the gentleman. He burst out laughing. He got into the Mercedes, "Follow me," and he set off. It was their way of saying, "You're on my patch. I'm the one in charge." And that's how it was. We caught on pretty quickly that in Corsica, it's the Corsicans who are in charge.
It took 17 months to find one of the Corsicans Michel Ferrari had singled out. Andre Benedetti was brought in for questioning, having been found hiding in a cupboard at his home next to a washing machine. 3 months later, Jacques Patachini was arrested in Nice. The two Corsican hoodlums were sent to Geneva to be called as witnesses in the trial of Michel Ferrari and his accomplices. In the courtroom, the two Corsicans naturally denied any involvement in the heist. UBS's lawyer questioned Andre Benedetti.
He asked him, "Mr. Benedetti, why were you hiding? What were you doing with the washing machine?" And he was as cool as you like, and he just said, "Sir, I was just doing laundry."
This set the tone. The Corsicans made no mention of other accomplices, nothing which could reduce the 7.5 years handed down to Michel Ferrari and his Swiss accomplices. The sentence was considered extremely harsh by the key player.
They judged the UBS case in relation to the amount of money, the fact that it was something you should never do in Switzerland. Don't touch the banks. You see what I mean? What we did was worse than a crime. Worse than a crime.
On the Swiss side, the case was concluded. But on the French side, the investigation was at a dead end. Because although there was a warrant for his arrest in the UBS case, Michel Casanova was nowhere to be found. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air, along with the €51 million jackpot from the Swiss bank.
Most of the stolen money had totally disappeared. It was highly likely it had lined the pockets of kingpins of the Brise de Mer. And from that moment, they were sitting pretty.
All the money that was stolen in this case, we never recovered a penny of it. It was very cleverly laundered back in the day. And after that, we couldn't pin any of it down.
Laundering. That means turning dirty money into clean money. Cleaning it to put it into legal business. The massive money laundering operation gave the Brise de Mer gang unlimited scope to come up with imaginative ideas.
They created different empires. The Brise de Mer created empires in legal businesses. They bought a financial advice company close to the arenas in Nice. They bought nice restaurants in Nice Old Town. They bought luxury apartment blocks. They invested on the Côte d'Azur, like in Cannes, a restaurant facing the beach. In short, really sound businesses. They invested in all. Water, Corsican whiskey, Corsican Coke, Corsican beer, Corsican charcuterie, wine. They had it all. They were now thought of as important businessmen. That's how far they'd come. They weren't bank robbers anymore. They were business guys, but the type who said, "You mess with us, you're done with, fucker."
The Brise de Mer gang had an eye for good businesses, for ones making money. They became partners in these flourishing businesses, always using the same method.
You'd walk into a restaurant once, twice, and at the end of the third time, the member of the Brise de Mer gang would say, "Come on, let's go and see the boss." Tapping him on the shoulder, you'd say, "It's going well, your business, isn't it? Let's become partners." And 9 times out of 10, people went into partnership, and the gang expanded its empire in Corsica and on the mainland, just by doing so. That's a characteristic of a mafia. It's the power of intimidation without having to use force. You tap someone on the shoulder, and the person lays down.
Little by little, it became hard to avoid the Brise de Mer gang. It wasn't just that they were approaching businesses, but businesses were coming to them.
There are businesses, whether it's in Corsica or anywhere, which get into financial difficulties. Happens all the time. And when you go and ask the bank and you don't get help with your money problems, who do they turn to?
Business owners were going of their own accord to see La Brise de Mer to ask for money, for protection. And that's how these corrupt relationships were created.
That's when it became clear that La Brise de Mer gang had taken things to a new level. In terms of money laundering, they reached a new level of sophistication and organization that meant they weren't just an ordinary criminal gang. They'd become a mafia.
And as with all mafias, the Godfathers had an office in a prime location where they listened to the grievances of the locals, whom they claimed to be helping, but were in fact controlling.
At that time, you had to go to see La Brise de Mer if you wanted to open a business. Francis Guazelli, one of the kingpins of La Brise de Mer, had a table at the back of the bar at Café Riche in the center of Bastia, and he'd meet there with entrepreneurs who wanted to open a business, and he'd tell them yes or no.
So you'd have, for example, different parties wanting to buy businesses who'd come to them to see them to get their approval. Warring parties who'd ask La Brise de Mer to arbitrate. And the kingpins of La Brise de Mer were there making decisions, dividing things up like justices of the peace.
That speaks to how all-powerful this gang was at that time.
But real economic power, the type that ensures revenues of tens of millions, is found elsewhere, in the public sector, the construction of hospitals, schools, nurseries, and even police stations. Lichard Casanova knew a good thing when he saw it. Of course, being in hiding after the UBS heist meant he had to be discreet, but that wasn't a problem. He just appointed frontmen to run his new construction company.
I'll summarize Richard Casanova for you. He was the Bernard Tapie of organized crime. You know, the famous businessman. He was that kind of a guy.
Well, in a few short years, Richard's company went from being a small business to being the #1 in Corsica. There were, 200 employees. Obviously, they squeezed the others out of the market. They made sure they had a monopoly on public construction projects.
The Brise knew that they needed to have politicians under their control in order to get contracts put out to tender. So they used their economic power to intimidate elected officials, which resulted in officials being under the thumb of the Brise de Mer gang.
La Brise de Mer gang used their money and the fear they aroused to affect the outcome of local elections, the local mayors, and the head of local regions.
You can't be powerful if you don't have politicians in your pocket. It's just not possible.
The Godfathers of the Brise de Mer were kingmakers. And these elected officials who owed them so much did all they could to give the nod to the right bit at the right time.
Politicians are just like you and me. In Corsica, they know what they're capable of. They know they can carry out a hit. So people tended to listen to La Brise de Mer gang at the time, you know?
Public construction contracts are the gifts they keep on giving. For Casanova and the Brise de Mer, it was like another heist of the century. As for the UBS job and the Corsican angle, it took 14 years for the trial of Michel Ferrari's suspected accomplices to finally open in Paris.
Ils seront 4 dans le box, présentés par l'accusation comme des membres du gang de la Brise de Mer, pour répondre de ce qu'on a appelé le casse du siècle.
The Patachini brothers and André Benedetti took the stand voluntarily. Alexandre Chevrier had been arrested a few months previously. The final suspected accomplice of the heist was conspicuous by his absence. Richard Casanova was still in hiding and wouldn't stand trial, at least for now.
Plus que le procès de ce qu'on a appelé le casse du siècle, il y a 14 ans, contre une banque de Genève, ce procès est surtout celui de la Brise de Mer.
The time for the trial came and we thought, there's loads of evidence, Michel Ferrari told them everything, there are photos, names. These people were likely to be found guilty. There was a big chance they'd be found guilty.
In the courtroom, Commissioner Maty could hardly wait for the trial to begin.
When I went into the vestibule of the court, Jacques Patachini spotted me straight away, and he said, "Joel, there's Commissioner Maty. Let's go and say hello." And they walked across and came down the stairs towards me. "We're glad you came," they said, shaking me by the hand. And I was really under pressure because I realized that, in actual fact, there was really only one witness, and that was me.
Marco Maty actually found out at the beginning of the session that Michel Ferrari and the other Swiss accomplices had declined to be witnesses at this new trial.
Michel Ferrari wasn't coming. Maybe in the intervening period, his fearlessness and bravado had evaporated somewhat.
I never wanted to go to the trial in Paris. Wasn't interested. What was I going to say? I wasn't interested in putting those people in prison. There was no point. That wasn't going to get me my money.
Without Michel Ferrari's testimony, what else did the prosecution have? A few photos which proved nothing, and Marco Maty's investigation, which had found no material evidence.
So, at the end, the prosecutor asked for them to be given 10 years, but he didn't hold out much hope.
The prosecutor knew there was nothing of substance in the file. On June 12, 2004 at 2 a.m., the sound of clapping rang out in the corridors of the court. Alexandre Chevrier, André Benedetti, and the Patachini brothers were found not guilty.
I thought it was fantastic. I mean, we were more or less relaxed about it because it was an old case, and who were the victims? I'm usually on the side of the victims, but in this instance, the victim was a big bank. And I think that the millions they lost that day were replaced pretty quickly.
The man behind the heist of the century remains bitter about the millions he'll never get his hands on.
I was the fool guy. While I was in prison, months went by, birthdays, Christmases went by, without me having any money. Whereas they were lying on the beach, drinking champagne, strutting around. That was the worst thing in the end. Knowing that the robbery was a success, but that I'd never got my share.
One mystery remained unsolved in the years following the UBS heist. Richard Casanova eluded capture for a long time and stayed in hiding for 16 years. It was a remarkably long time to stay in hiding, and it raised plenty of questions in particular for the police and the justice system.
The legend of Richard Casanova, if it can be called that, recounts that they were looking for him after the so-called heist of the century at UBS. Well, there was a time when they were looking for him, but not that hard.
From time to time, I took out the file of wanted suspects. I was surprised to notice that Richard Casanova's form kept disappearing and then reappearing.
In '96, there was an initiative to restart the search for Casanova. Sometimes later, we were told to stop. That's all. It's not a complicated story. Why? I don't ask about the whys and wherefores. I'm a field officer. I do my job, and that's it.
I know you want to find out if he was being protected by someone. I'm not going to answer because I simply don't know. The fact is that the length of time he was in hiding is really extraordinary.
So extraordinary that at one point, rumors were circulating in Corsica. Casanova was being protected by the cops in return for information he provided on Corsican nationalists. Casanova, a police informer? The rumor spread like wildfire.
Richard hated informers. He hated that. He thought it was the worst insult ever. If he wanted to insult someone, the first thing he said was, well, he's an informer, a grass. It was the ultimate insult, and that drove him crazy.
To remove part of the mystery surrounding Casanova's time in hiding, we need to look beyond Corsica and to look at a very powerful man, also from Corsica, but who lives far from that beautiful island on the continent of Africa.
Richard Casanova was protected most notably by one of his great friends by the name of Michel Thommy. Michel Thommy was a sort of king of gambling and casinos, especially in Africa. And he is, in a way, the embodiment of the networks that run through Francophone Africa.
C'est pour ça qu'on vous appelle l'empereur des jeux en Afrique?
Oh, vous savez, empereur, pas du tout. On est venu pour être bien installé dans le pays et pas venir simplement pour prendre de l'argent et s'en aller, vous voyez? Parce que regardez la qualité du produit, ça a 4 ans.
This casino in Libreville, Gabon, is just a tiny fraction of the outrageously successful business empire run by Michel Thommy. But this former croupier turned casino entrepreneur has come a long way. In 1988, he was involved in an embezzlement case, and Africa provided him with a chance to start again.
Michel Thommy moved into the world of gambling in Africa and introduced the PMU Gambling Company into French-speaking Africa, which brought in huge revenues and gave him access to very high-level contacts in the governments of certain African countries.
Richard Casanova was in hiding and needed to widen his horizons. As luck would have it, Michel Thommy needed someone like him to manage some tricky situations. In 1994, Richard Casanova had supposedly helped Michel Thommy to buy a casino in Annemasse in Haute-Savoie. This transaction was made possible thanks to the intervention of Charles Pasqua, who was the interior minister at the time. A judicial inquiry found that part of the net gain made on the resale of the casino ended up in Pasqua's campaign coffers for the 1999 European elections.
They were known as the Pasqua networks, and Michel Thommy was a member, as were a certain number of gangsters whom the network protected, including Richard Casanova.
Les réseaux Pasqua, je vais vous dire, à mon avis, me concernant du moins, ça ne peut être qu'un réseau d'amitié et de relations amicales.
Donc vous faites partie du réseau?
Je n'ai jamais eu de lien, moi, et d'amitié professionnelle avec M. Pasqua. C'est simplement de l'affection en dehors des affaires.
This friendship group was very helpful to Richard Casanova, and he quickly established contacts in African high society, in Cameroon, in Congo, and especially in Gabon, Michel Thommy's fiefdom.
This was a change on a personal level. He entered a very murky world, a parallel world.
This parallel world was one of state secrets, of diplomacy in the shadows, by its very nature, complex and impenetrable. And there was a lot at stake. France's economic power in West Africa and its strategic interests in the region. Naturally, the intelligence services of the different countries concerned played a crucial role in all of this.
The Corsicans did a lot for France. In Africa, for example, they're still doing it now, because French influence in Africa is still a reality. And back then, the special forces would do favors for some of the bad guys, the ones they thought were capable, intelligent, brave people, because they knew that they'd do their dirty work for them, if needed.
Was Richard Casanova a liaison agent for French secret services? This question has obsessed onlookers for 3 decades.
Casanova was in hiding, but he was seen by several people at a reception at the French Ministry of the Interior. When we're able to get hold of certain declassified documents, we'll be able to tell if he was working for French intelligence services in Africa.
Bernard Squarcini, head of intelligence services at the time, appears to confirm this theory.
Many sources told us that he worked for a department that benefited from the advantage of working outside of our national boundaries. But as far as I'm concerned, I've never seen within my own department any written document which could have come from this gentleman.
And you never met with him?
No. Contrary to what's been reported.
The former intelligence boss is categoric. There was no link between his department and the central figure of the Brise de Mer gang. And yet, it's almost certainly the case that Casanova received protection during his time in hiding.
Richard had informants in the police. In particular, one officer he became friends with, who was very close to someone high up.
So who is Casanova's mysterious protector? 2 names regularly crop up in connection with this. On the one hand, Bernard Squarcini, the intelligence boss, and on the other, Roger Marion, the head of the police.
They hit the ball back into each other's court. You protected him. I wanted to arrest him. We could have gotten him, but then you didn't do it.
Bernard Squarcini's name almost certainly crops up in connection with this affair because of his links to Michel Thommy.
He's a friend, but I'm not involved in business with him. We have family ties. He helped us in Africa when we sent in a liaison officer. We increased our capacity to get intelligence in the fight against terrorism. He was a fantastic intermediary for us, of course.
As for Roger Marion, he was suspected of removing Richard Casanova's name from the organized crime suspects file. He not only denies this, but also thinks that it raises questions on certain practices within the intelligence services.
The question is, why were the intelligence services interested in the USB heist, in organized crime? It's a good question, isn't it? To the point where Bernard Squarcini was summoned before the magistrate to explain why he was carrying out surveillance on police officers.
What Roger Marion seems to be suggesting is that the intelligence services were carrying out surveillance on police officers investigating Richard Casanova.
I had at least 3 documented cases of precise information about Richard Casanova's whereabouts in Corsica. When the police arrived, there was no one there, and they realized that he'd been tipped off, and that it had come from a very high level. We're talking Ministry of the Interior level.
There was no evidence to indicate that Richard Casanova was a rat or a police informer. It seemed as though the wide-reaching business opportunities afforded to him by Michel Thommy in Africa provided him with long-lasting protection. One thing is certain. During his time in hiding, the strategic brains behind the Brise de Mer gang gradually moved into organized crime on a whole other level and set up new networks and alliances. An opportunity for the Brise de Mer gang to exploit this change and to grow even bigger. Except that some of Richard Casanova's brothers in arms ended up seeing this as the beginning of a betrayal.
Casca tu si teto in Napoli.